For years, Western strategists have been fixated on one point when looking at maps: Kaliningrad. Located right in the heart of Europe, it is a fully militarized region equipped with nuclear-capable Iskander missiles, S-400 air defense systems, and the entire Russian Baltic fleet. This was Putin's biggest trump card against NATO, a dagger pointed at Europe. Until yesterday. Today, that dagger is turned against Russia itself. NATO has fired its most destructive and unexpected weapon against Russia: bureaucracy. Without firing a single shot, Poland and Lithuania used a single European Union law to turn Putin's impregnable fortress into an open-air prison overnight. With just one EU law, Kaliningrad's land connections were severed. This was not a declaration of war. It was a strategic checkmate. In October 2025, Poland and Lithuania invoked the relevant articles of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, citing persistent hybrid threats and Russia's constant violations of international law. This seemingly technical and bureaucratic move was actually one of the most daring moves ever made against Russia, a nuclear power. With this decision, all road and rail transit through Polish and Lithuanian territory from Russia to Kaliningrad, or from Kaliningrad to Russia, was completely halted for goods subject to EU sanctions. To understand the genius of this operation and the helplessness it created for Russia, it is necessary to first examine in detail the fragile lifelines of Kaliningrad, and then how these lifelines were severed. Under normal circumstances, Kaliningrad's economic and social life breathed through two main land corridors. The Lithuanian corridor was the most vital lifeline. Freight trains from Russian centers such as Pskov and St. Petersburg entered Lithuanian territory via Belarus, passing south of Vilnius to reach Kaliningrad. Almost all heavy cargo such as military equipment, heavy industrial products, coal and grain was transported via this railway line. In the Polish corridor, trucks entering Poland via Belarus passed through the northeast of Warsaw and skirted the strategic Suwałki Gap to reach Kaliningrad. Food, consumer goods, and lighter commercial products generally used this route. These two corridors were the arteries connecting Kaliningrad to Russia. Without these arteries, it would have been impossible to feed Kaliningrad's civilian population of 1 million, resupply its garrison of tens of thousands of soldiers, and keep the Baltic fleet operational. Resupplying by sea and air was both extremely expensive and, in a crisis, a much more militarily vulnerable method. Ukraine's successes against Russian ships in the Black Sea using naval drones had already proven how risky sea-based resupply was. Therefore, Kaliningrad was entirely dependent on these transit routes through the territories of Poland and Lithuania, both NATO and EU members, to survive. However, Poland and Lithuania turned this geographical dependency into a strategic weapon. What they did was not to declare a new blockade. What they did was to strictly enforce the sanctions that the European Union was already imposing on Russia due to the war in Ukraine, also for transit goods passing through their territories. So what did this list of sanctioned goods contain? And what did it mean for Kaliningrad? What does this mean? The land entry of hundreds of products into Kaliningrad is now prohibited, including cement, metal, coal, high-tech products, machine parts, and even luxury consumer goods. This list is so comprehensive that it effectively halts the transit of almost everything that sustains Kaliningrad's military and civilian economy, except for basic human necessities such as food and medicine. The most ingenious aspect of this blockade is the way it is implemented. There are no tanks or soldiers stopping Russian convoys at the border. There are only Polish and Lithuanian customs officers, calmly and professionally doing their jobs, with tablets displaying EU regulations. The process is brutally simple. A train or truck convoy from Russia reaches the border. Customs officers take the cargo manifest and compare each item on the list with the EU's thousands of sanctioned items. If even one wagon or container contains a prohibited product, not just that wagon or truck, but the entire convoy is turned back. There are no exceptions. This is an infuriating bureaucratic nightmare for Russia. There is no military target to retaliate against. There is no act of aggression to complain about. There are only European officials saying, "Sorry, those are the rules." This is an army being strangled not by missiles, but by regulations, paperwork, and patience. Every customs officer has become a soldier on the front lines of this war. NATO's move not only cuts a logistics line, but also destroys two fundamental military doctrines that Russia has relied on for decades. The escalation to de-escalate doctrine has failed. This Russian doctrine essentially aims to intimidate the opposing side into retreating by threatening to use nuclear weapons or launching a limited nuclear strike when a conventional conflict goes awry. However, this doctrine becomes completely ineffective when there is no military target to escalate against. NATO is challenging Russia not with a warship or a military base, but with a piece of legislation. Putin cannot launch a nuclear missile in response to a customs regulation. If he does, he will be branded a mad leader and will have the entire world against him. This legal move has taken away Putin's biggest bargaining chip. Kaliningrad has been marketed for years as an access denial/area dominance bubble by Russian propaganda. With the S-400 and Iskander missiles deployed there, it was claimed to have declared a large part of the Baltic Sea and half of Poland off-limits to NATO aircraft and ships. However, this latest move has turned this A2/AD shield into a cage isolating Kaliningrad from the outside world. Those missiles no longer keep NATO out. They trap Russia's Baltic fleet and garrison inside. A strategic asset has suddenly become a massive logistical burden and a trap. The effects of this bureaucratic strangulation operation extend far beyond Kaliningrad's borders, toppling a series of geopolitical dominoes. The most obvious and cruel result of this legal strangulation operation is the peninsula's condemnation to complete isolation. However, this isolation is much more than a geographical disconnect visible on a map. It means the severing of ties with the modern world for a civilian population of nearly 1 million and tens of thousands of military personnel, the collapse of living standards, and the destruction of future hopes. The Kremlin's impregnable fortress has now become an open-air prison for the people inside. In this prison, the walls are not made of iron but of empty supermarket shelves, broken gas pumps, and cancelled flights. There is a huge difference between the cost of transporting a container by truck or train and the cost of bringing the same container by ship from St. Petersburg to Kaliningrad. Moreover, this route now passes through the Baltic Sea, which has become one of the most tense seas in the world. No international insurance company will insure a ship sailing this route without applying an exorbitant war risk premium. These additional costs are directly reflected in the price of every bottle of water and every bag of flour that reaches Kaliningrad. More importantly, a slow-moving civilian cargo ship is practically a sitting target in modern warfare. As Ukraine has demonstrated in the Black Sea, it is easy prey for kamikaze sea drones or anti-ship missiles that could be deployed along the coasts of Poland and Sweden. The Russian Baltic fleet's constant escort of these ships is both costly and puts its own warships at risk. Transporting cargo by air is the most expensive logistics method. Transporting all of a city's basic needs by plane is economic suicide. The Soviet air bridge during the Berlin blockade was only possible with the combined resources of a massive Western alliance. It is impossible for Russia to achieve this alone with its depleted air force in Ukraine. The air corridor stretching from St. Petersburg to Kaliningrad is completely surrounded by NATO airspace. Swedish Gripen fighters, Polish F-16s, or German Eurofighters taking off from NATO bases in Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland could close this corridor in seconds. In a crisis, every Russian transport aircraft attempting to pass through this air bridge would either be forced to land or face the risk of being shot down. In short, Kaliningrad's new lifelines are actually extremely thin and fragile threads that could be severed at any moment. This logistical paralysis would render the life of an ordinary citizen in Kaliningrad unrecognizable within a few weeks. What they are now deprived of are not luxury goods, but the most basic necessities of modern life. These physical deprivations create a deep psychological devastation on the people of Kaliningrad. For years, Kaliningraders saw themselves as different from the rest of Russia, more European. Shopping in Poland on weekends, sitting in a cafe in Lithuania, was part of their lifestyle. This blockade takes away their identity and privilege. They now feel like a forgotten, isolated Russian colony in the middle of Europe, not part of Europe. The most devastating feeling is that of being abandoned by Moscow. While watching images of normal life in Moscow and St. Petersburg on state television, they see empty shelves and gas queues in their own cities. They feel they have been sacrificed as pawns for Putin's geopolitical games. This fundamentally shakes their loyalty to the Kremlin. The people of Kaliningrad are already much more connected to Europe than to Moscow. In an unofficial referendum held in 2023, 72% of Kaliningrad residents voted in favor of independence. This was a clear sign that the Kremlin was losing control. Putin's invasion of Ukraine has increased pressure on Kaliningrad. Protests in the region, economic hardship and isolation are fueling public discontent. The people of Kaliningrad do not believe Russia's propaganda and know they are paying the price for the Kremlin's military plans. In addition to the civilian impact, Russian national pride has been diminished. Kaliningrad is not just a military base for Russia, but also a symbol of victory in World War II and the conquest of Prussia. The fact that this symbolic land has been reduced to a helpless state through bureaucratic maneuvers without a single shot being fired is a deep psychological blow to Russia's image as a great power and to its national pride. This is the story of a superpower being bogged down in paperwork. This move also sends a clever message to China, Russia's most important ally. China's One Belt, One Road project relies on stable land and rail routes extending to Europe. This action by NATO and the EU demonstrates how fragile these routes are, and that the West has the power to sever them at will with a political decision. Beijing must now calculate how its tacit support for Russia could also jeopardize its own economic interests. This situation is triggering a strategic recalculation in Beijing that is creating diplomatic ripples far beyond Kaliningrad. NATO's ingenious move has strategically checkmated Putin. He now has no good options, only bad and worse ones. Putin could do nothing and watch Kaliningrad slowly suffocate. This would be a show of great weakness both domestically and internationally, destroying his image as a strong leader. Putin could attack NATO by responding militarily to a customs operation. This would mean all-out war with the entire alliance and result in absolute destruction for Russia. Putin could continue his aggressive rhetoric on the international stage. This strategy has been systematically implemented, especially since 2022. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, one of the Kremlin's most influential spokespeople on foreign policy, is the main face of this approach. In a statement in May 2022, Lavrov claimed that the West had launched a collective hybrid war and argued that this war was being sustained by military and economic support to Ukraine. Lavrov argued that the West had forced them into war, saying, "We did everything to prevent a direct conflict, but now the challenge is clear, and we accept it." He also emphasized that Russia was no stranger to sanctions and had been subjected to such pressure throughout history. These statements reflected the dual message the Kremlin was trying to convey to the international community. The first message was that NATO and Western countries were the ones who started the conflict. The second and more important message was that Russia was prepared for this struggle. The Kremlin positioned itself as both the victim and the resistance fighter, defining the West as the provocateur and attempting to convince the public of this. However, this rhetoric was repeated over and over again without changing in content. By September 2025, Lavrov's statements were still the same. This time, the target was not only the countries supporting Ukraine, but almost the entire Western world. Lavrov claimed that Western countries had declared war on Russia because of their support for Ukraine. According to him, the rest of Europe had effectively become part of the conflict because it had dared to react openly to Russia's aggression. These claims were raised again at the G20 summit and at the meeting of foreign ministers held at the United Nations in September. Lavrov argued here too that the West's aid to Ukraine had led to a global crisis. He went even further, suggesting that NATO, the European Union, and even the United Nations had entered into direct conflict with Russia. However, these claims were part of a false narrative that the Kremlin had been constructing for a long time. In reality, the support provided by the West was not an act of war. It was political and defensive measures taken against a state acting in violation of international law. Lavrov's rhetoric has become one of Russia's classic propaganda tactics, used both to consolidate its domestic audience and to create a perception of victimhood abroad. But even this rhetoric is no longer finding sufficient support. Putin may try to divert attention by creating new crises in other areas, such as Syria, Africa, or cyberspace. But this does not solve the fundamental problem in Kaliningrad. So, will Putin admit defeat in chess and walk away from the table, or will he blow up the entire board? The world is holding its breath, waiting. This is not just a blockade, it is the clearest proof of how a regime's bluff is seen and how strategic intelligence prevails over brute force. What do you think? What could Russia's next move be against this legal and economic blockade? And what does this incident tell us about the future of modern warfare? Share your valuable opinions and analyses with us in the comments section. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and like this video to support our independent analyses.